Good morning. Welcome to another episode of The Road to Heaven. My name is Kyle Sanders. I'm the evangelist for the McRaven Road Church of Christ. My thought I want you to have with me this morning is about worship. Now, worship is offered throughout our nation, throughout our town, and it's offered on many different days of the week. It's offered in many different formats, and with different things emphasized one group to the next. And it seems interesting and a bit odd when we compare the way worship's described in the New Testament with the way worship is offered throughout our city and even throughout the world. One thing that's striking, though, that I want you to consider this morning is who was present in the first century when the church was established that would be able to direct worship in such a way that it would be pleasing to God. And I think any good student of the Bible knows that these would be the apostles. The men who Jesus had commissioned, beginning in Matthew 28, and then sent on their way to make disciples of every nation, and specifically to teach them all they had been commanded by Christ. The apostles would have been present at the first worship services after the church is started in Acts the 2nd chapter. Peter and John and others would have been there to direct the worship in the way it needed to go. And this would have been the case when the church began to spread to other towns. But what happens when those towns begin to corrupt their worship? What happens when, for instance, say in a place like Corinth, the worship becomes chaotic? It becomes misguided, based on wrong principles. Of course, Paul wrote 2 letters to the Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians, he goes about the process of correcting their worship. 1 Corinthians 11, he addresses their issues that they're having in regards to the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians, specifically chapter 11 and verse 17, he says, "But in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse." Now that's an interesting phrase, because if worship can be just offered any way we see fit, so long as we call it worship, we seem to think that it will be okay. But Paul states that their worship of the one true God, their worship as Christians, was not for the better, but for the worse. For one, verse 18, he hears that there's divisions among them. They are corrupting the Lord's Supper, taking it as a common meal and using it to be filled with food. And even more telling is in verse 34 of the same chapter. After addressing the issue there of the Lord's Supper, the end of verse 34 is interesting. He says, "About the other things, I will give directions when I come." Paul, being an apostle, being one authorized by Jesus to teach and to guide Christians on his behalf, indicates here that he would be the one giving instructions. So then how does our worship today compare to the worship that they gave directions to then? If they had authority then to direct and guide the way worship should be, then that authority is still present and active today. In the first century, the way they worshipped is very much unlike the way many worship today. In the first century, when Christians were first created, Acts chapter 2, verse 42, says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Is our worship today devoted as theirs was, not to man-made philosophy, not to feel-good stories and anecdotes about our life? Is it devoted to the apostles' teaching? Is it devoted as they were to being in fellowship with one another, to being in unison, not compromise based on similar principles, but unison under the headship of Christ? Do we break the bread? Do we partake of the Lord's Supper in a way that's honorable, in a way that's appropriate, and in a way that was commanded? And then at the end of verse 42 in Acts 2, and the prayers. Are we gathering to pray to one another? Are we gathering to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to one another, the way Paul wrote to the Ephesians and the Colossian brethren that they ought to be doing, making melody in their hearts to the Lord? Are we laying by in store on the first day of the week, the way he wrote to those same Corinthian brethren in 1 Corinthians 16? When we look at the way we worship today, we have to think, would Peter or Paul or James or John or any of the rest approve of what we're doing? Would the men authorized by Christ to lead his church and to provide guidance, and we have that guidance in the New Testament, would those men give an amen to the service that we offer today? We would like for you to come by and experience what worship according to the New Testament looks like. We worship at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings and at 6 o'clock that evening. We also gather for Bible study at 9 a.m. on Sundays and 7 p.m. on Wednesday evenings. We thank you for joining us on a road to heaven, the road to heaven. And we promise if you come visit with us, you come see the way we try to emulate the worship of the New Testament, you'll receive a warm welcome and a hearty handshake. But more importantly, you'll receive a thus saith the Lord for everything that we do as a part of our worship. Thank you for joining us. Heaven will surely